Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our weekly podcast, Palestine This Week, the show where we take a deep dive into the key issues from Palestine and the wider region. This week, we're looking at how Israeli impunity has triggered yet another war, this time with Iran. We'll be looking at what this means for Palestine, the region, and the wider world. I am, as always, joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nasim. It's always a pleasure.
When we last recorded the show, Moin, I think few would have predicted events to unfold in the manner that they have, which is why this week we'll be spending most of our show discussing Iran,
This week in
um,
Iran.
this week in Iran, yes, and what that means for Palestine. But let's start with the situation that led to the unprovoked attack on Iran, bearing in mind that this episode, which will be released tomorrow. And by the time it's released, the US may have already committed its troops in supporting Israel. So, with that in mind, I want to begin by asking, why now? Why did Israel launch an unprovoked attack on Iran last Friday, given this has been Benjamin Netanyahu's crusade for the last 3 decades, I would say? He's been lobbying Washington, every American president, to strike Iran and degrade its nuclear weapons, but I think ultimately seeking some kind of regime change. So, as I said, the obvious question is why now?
Yeah. Well, I think if you'll give me a few minutes, I think we have to understand this attack in three interrelated contexts. The first concerns Israeli-Iranian relations. The second concerns Israel's posture in the region. And the third concerns the United States' shifting geopolitical posture. And as I said, the three are quite interrelated. Regarding the first, since the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, when Israel lost a strategic ally, one of its key allies in the region, the ousted Shah of Iran, regime change in Iran has always been an Israeli ambition. In fact, in 1979, Israel's last ambassador to Iran, Uri Lubrani, proposed recruiting a group of royalists in Iran who, in his words, would be prepared to shoot dead 10,000 Iranian demonstrators in the streets of Tehran in order to restore the Shah to power. And as many of your viewers will know, Israel and Iran have been involved in what is often termed a shadow war for many decades. And what we've seen since the 90s is Israel regularly issuing these alarmist, shrill, but bogus warnings that Iran is on the cusp of developing a nuclear weapon and that it will, like Israel, become a nuclear power. And from Israel's point of view, as we saw with its attack on Iraq in 1981 and on Syria in 2007, it's not just a matter of preventing other states in the Middle East from also acquiring a nuclear weapon, but ensuring that no other state in the Middle East develops the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon. So, in that sense, what we're dealing with here is a war initiated by Israel whose strategic purpose is to preserve Israel's nuclear monopoly in the Middle East, to ensure that Israel and Israel alone possesses nuclear weapons in the Middle East, because as is widely known, universally known, I would add, even if not acknowledged by either Israel or its Western sponsors and allies, Israel is believed to have something in the range of 200 nuclear bombs and missiles. What's happened in the past few months is that the United States initiated negotiations with Iran to see if the US and Iran could reach a new deal by which the United States would ensure that Iran was incapable of producing a nuclear weapon with watertight guarantees, while from Iran's perspective, it would preserve its rights to a civilian nuclear program as guaranteed under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, to which Iran is a party, but Israel, of course, doesn't accept. Israel has never ratified. And Israel's objective became to sabotage these negotiations because Israel's agenda is war with Iran. Israel's agenda is regime change with Iran. And Israel's worst nightmare is a negotiated resolution of the tensions between the United States and Iran. Now, regarding the United States, it comes down to one of two possibilities. Either the initiative to seek to negotiate a diplomatic resolution of US Iranian resolutions was a ruse from the beginning. The US never intended to negotiate seriously with Iran, and the whole purpose of these negotiations was simply to provide camouflage for a military attack on Iran, the decision for which had been made already from the very outset. Or the United States was initially serious about negotiating with Iran, but then got derailed as a result of the lobbying of the White House by Israel and by the Iran hawks in the US administration. I think if you look at the evidence, it seems clear to me at least that the US initially was pursuing a diplomatic rather than military resolution of this issue. And that has to do with a number of factors, including that the Republican Party is deeply split between Iran hawks and non-interventionists who have increasingly drifted from the Democratic to the Republican Party. Now, Israel, in my view, managed to achieve several objectives. First, it convinced the Trump administration and effectively the person who was the Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, bearing in mind that neither Trump nor Witkoff are particularly smart or particularly conversant with realities in the Middle East. They don't really know Iran well, and they have basically gutted the administration of relevant expertise. Israel managed to convince them that Iran could be bullied and intimidated into accepting an agreement whereby Iran would forswear any nuclear enrichment, including at very low levels for exclusively civilian purposes, on Iranian soil. Anyone who has looked into this issue would tell you this will never happen. This is an absolute red line for Iran, because just as for the United States, the red line is Iranian possession of a nuclear weapon and watertight guarantees that it can never have one. For Iran, the red line is not renouncing the rights it enjoys under the NPT. But Israel and the Iran hawks managed to convince Trump and Witkoff that this was a feasible demand. Then Iran, of course, rejected it. Then the White House was persuaded that Israel could conduct a decapitation strike on Iran, and that as a result of that strike, the Iranian regime would be in chaos and disarray and would be willing to accept whatever the United States dictated to it. Israel may have believed this, but I don't think it did. And even if it did, what we've seen is that Iran managed to recover from this initial extremely effective strike quite quickly. The regime and its armed forces and its security forces remain coherent, and it has retaliated, I believe, in ways that Israel did not anticipate. And so now we're hearing another claim, which is that if the United States will only conduct one massive bombing run on Iran, it will be all over, and the US can then dictate to Iran whatever terms it pleases because Iran will be left with no choice but to accept those terms. This, I don't think, is going to work either. Now, in terms of the specific timing, as you may recall, when Trump announced negotiations, he said he would give them 60 days to succeed. And Israel commenced its war on Iran on the 61st day. So if you know if we want to look at this in perspective, what we're basically being asked to believe is that when two parties are negotiating and the first party gives the second party a deadline before which it has to accept all of the first party's demands, that if the second party does not accept all those demands, that gives any third party a legitimate right to launch a war against the second party. Basically, we're looking at a situation in which international law, the laws of war, international norms and values, to the extent that they had not already been shredded since October 2023, they no longer exist. They exist only in textbooks and libraries of international law. The laws of war have now been definitively and permanently shredded. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. The second point I would make is referring to your question. It was a combination of Israeli impunity to do as it pleases since October 2023, and the fact that no one was ever held accountable, either in the United States or in Great Britain, for the 2003 illegal invasion, occupation, and destruction of Iraq that has led us to this point. You can't its broader regional and historical and international context.
Thanks, Moin. You covered a lot of ground there. I think you've summarized most of the topics and the themes that will be raised here. So we will be diving into some, many of the points that you've already raised. But before we dive into some of those issues, I want to ask first about the IAEA report that came out last week. Netanyahu has made his whole, I would say, justification for launching this assault on the IAEA report. The report did say that Iran has failed to meet its obligation for the first time in 20 years. But the same report then goes on to say that there is no evidence that Iran is close to developing a nuclear weapon. The same conclusion was made by Tulsi Gabbard, the US National Security Advisor, I think last month, that Iran is a long way away from actually developing nuclear weapons. And as a result, the Iranians have accused the IAEA of becoming extremely politicized, and even to the point they're saying they're colluding with Israel. And Israel, Iran, of course, then released a number of documents, several documents to prove that claim. So what's the significance of these revelations? And also, do you think now Iran will exit the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons? Is that its goal? And would that not actually undermine the international effort to have a Middle East free of nuclear weapons? So just putting it up to you.
Well, once again, Israel is a drunken sailor slurring his way through a speech about the importance of sobriety and getting a standing ovation for doing so from Western political elites and leaders. It's really so difficult to fathom. So what happened is that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has determined that, as you mentioned, Iran is no closer, or at least has not taken any decision to develop a nuclear weapon, and that there is no evidence that Iran intends to possess one. But for the first time in 20 years, and this is as a result of the Europeans voting against Iran, the IAEA found Iran in violation of its commitments to the IAEA. And I think this helped set the stage for Israel's war that it launched against Iran. And in my view, the Europeans knew exactly what they were doing in terms of extending a veil of legitimacy, or seeking to do so at least, to what Israel did several days later. Again, I think it's important to emphasize Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East. Israel launched this war in order to preserve its nuclear monopoly in the Middle East. There are ultimately only two ways this can be resolved. either through continuous wars against any other power in the Middle East that seeks to challenge Israel's monopoly, and that monopoly ultimately will be successfully challenged, or by pursuing a policy of a nuclear-free Middle East. Ultimately, those are the only two alternatives, and Israel quite clearly has chosen the former. And as we now see, in doing so, Israel enjoys the unconditional support of the West in its efforts to remain the only nuclear power in the Middle East and to retain its monopoly on that. And it bears mentioning again, Israel has not ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel does not accept meaningful inspections of its nuclear facilities by the IAEA. Israel effectively is a lawless nuclear power that sits outside the international inspection and monitoring regime and has been permitted to do so by its Western sponsors and allies. And in this particular case, I think the Europeans played a key role in seeking to extend legitimacy to Israel's subsequent attack. And as others have noted, the minute Israel attacked Iran, and before Iran had even begun it with its retaliation, you already had the European powers condemning Iran for its aggression against Israel and trumpeting, as they do every time children are shredded to pieces in the Gaza Strip, trumpeting Israel's right to self-defense.
Mm. And another, um, I would say, shameful display was not just the defense of Israel, but constantly repeating the talking points, like Israel is carrying out preemptive strike. Um, I don't know any aggressor in the world who did not carry out war, justifying as some form of preemptive attack. Putin did the same when it comes to Ukraine. We, of course, remember the invasion of Iraq as well. But does the IAEA report actually provide sufficient justification to carry out a preemptive strike? As I
No, of
mentioned,
course not.
Tulsi Gabbard, who made the conclusion, I think, just last month, and also today CNN published a report saying that, citing US officials, saying that Iran was something like 3 years away from weaponizing weaponizing, well, creating a nuclear weapon. So it doesn't seem like that the IAEA report can be used as any justification for
No.
preemptive war. And preemptive war has a very narrow
Yes.
definition under international law. So I mean, if you
Yes.
can provide an explanation for that, and that'd be useful.
Sure. Well, under international law, and I feel that we're essentially wasting our time on this because, as I pointed out before, international law no longer exists. It has been permanently and definitively shredded, first and foremost, by those who claim to be upholding it. International law, as we have known it, will exist only in dusty books in libraries on account of what we've seen in the last 2 years. It has become entirely meaningless. But having said that, the international law that existed previously, and specifically Article 51 of the UN Charter, allows states to go to war, to use armed force, only in conditions of self-defense. That does not mean that you're only allowed to take up arms after you are attacked. You are, in fact, allowed to take up arms before you are attacked, but only if you are facing a real, imminent, and certain threat to your national security. In other words, if a neighboring country is massing troops on your borders and announcing that it intends to invade, that would count as a legitimate grounds for preemptive defense. But because a country says it hates you and would like to see you disappear, and is a nuclear threshold state, and has not taken any preparations to launch an imminent, certain attack on you, of course not. Any first-year law student will tell you that is an absolutely meaningless justification. Now, regarding Iran, Iran, as a result of the first Trump administration's unilateral renunciation of the 2015 nuclear agreement and its enrichment of uranium to increasingly high levels since then, has become a nuclear threshold state. What nuclear threshold state means is that Iran is essentially a political decision rather than significant technological developments away from possessing a nuclear weapon. Iran is capable of producing a nuclear weapon if, first and foremost, its leadership takes a political decision to possess a nuclear arsenal, and there is no indication it has yet done so. And secondly, once it possesses the highly enriched uranium required for a nuclear bomb, it will then have to design and produce an actual weapon, and in addition, design and produce a delivery mechanism for such a weapon. And what you either believe Israel and its cheerleaders in the West, who give you an ideological interpretation of reality that Iran is seeking to possess a bomb, can do so tomorrow morning, as we've been told ever since the early 1990s, and the minute it has one is going to drop it on Washington, London, and Tel Aviv. Or you believe the specialists and experts who have been studying this in extraordinary detail for decades and are able to do so because in 2015, in addition to being a signatory to the NPT and accepting IAEA monitoring and inspections, Iran in the nuclear agreement accepted the most intrusive monitoring and verification system of its nuclear facilities ever devised during the nuclear age. And what these experts and specialists are saying is that there is no evidence that Iran has taken that political decision. That may now, of course, change. It may not, but it may well do so. And that Iran has not yet developed the technical aspects of actually producing a nuclear bomb or missile once it has sufficient amounts of sufficiently enriched uranium. So to present this as somehow justifying a preemptive attack in line with the right to self-defense, which again requires that Iran pose an imminent, meaning like as in, within the next few days at most, and certain threat of an attack on Israel is absolute bogus. And that is why this is properly seen as an unprovoked war of aggression. And just to bear in mind, because we have been talking so much about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in recent months, the crime of aggression is also considered one of the main charges that can be leveled by the International Criminal Court, in addition to these other crimes.
Just before we came in, I saw an interview with Trump. He was being questioned by a journalist. He was asked about that very claim by Tulsi Gabbard that Iran was a long way away from developing a nuclear weapon. And Trump basically said, I don't care what she said. So it seems like he's already decided that America will get involved. And is that how you see it developing? I mean, as I said, by the time this is aired tomorrow, um, America may have already committed its planes and troops, or planes at least. Is that the direction it's heading at the moment, in your point of view? Because
It
Trump seems
certainly
to be
seems that way.
suggesting that. So go on.
Yes, it certainly seems that way. I mean, again, we're speaking on Tuesday, and this video will be aired on Wednesday. Look, we're now in a situation where it's critically dangerous, of course, if the US does get involved. And there are also risks if the US doesn't get involved, because if the US doesn't get involved, and Iran not only maintains the coherence of its leadership, of its military institutions, and is able to retaliate with increasingly painful blows against Israel, then it's entirely likely that Israel will respond, as it has already announced it would, by applying the so-called Dahya doctrine, on Tehran and other Iranian cities. Now, the Dahi Doctrine, for those who don't know it, was a military doctrine announced by the Israeli military in response to the 2006 war with Lebanon, in which the military objective is not just to attack, weaken, and hopefully eradicate a military adversaries, but to, as a matter of policy, inflict extraordinary and deliberately disproportionate death and destruction on civilians and civilian infrastructure in the opponent's, in the adversary's territory in order to weaken their political will and in order to turn the local population against its leadership. This is an Israeli military doctrine for those who still believe in the most moral army in the solar system. That's the and so that's the first risk. And the second risk is that it's entirely possible that if Iran is able to administer sufficient damage on Israel in its retaliatory strikes, it's entirely possible. I certainly wouldn't exclude the prospect of Israel deploying a nuclear bomb on Tehran. Now, if that happens, we would be not only in the horrific, but also extraordinary, ironic situation where Israel, which claims to have initiated this war of aggression in order to prevent Iran from possessing nuclear weapons, ends up using one itself against Iran. If the US does get involved, then we're looking at the entire region on fire, because I find it very difficult to believe that a single massive US strike, no matter how violent and how effective, is going to decapitate and eliminate the Iranian regime, its nuclear program, its ballistic missile capabilities, and its ability to strike back. And then we can expect Iran, for example, to seek to shut off the Straits of Hormuz, through which huge amounts of energy to world markets flow every day. It will presumably begin to attack US military facilities throughout the region. We're then looking at a region on fire. We're then looking at a regional war. And then the question becomes whether Russia and China will seek to lower the temperature or will see an opportunity to weaken the United States. And that, I think, remains an unanswered question. What is the United States going to do? Well, I may be wrong, but my belief is that the US did not engage Iran with an intention of seeking a pretext for a military attack on Iran from the outset, but that the US first believed that it was possible to make unreasonable demands on Iran, and when that failed, believed that a short, sharp war could succeed in imposing diktats on Iran. And now we're in a situation where Trump appears to have been persuaded that Iran is sufficiently weakened that he can impose whatever conditions he wants on Iran, and that if Iran rejects those conditions, which I think it almost certainly will, that the US can then achieve its objectives with one massive strike against Iran and thereby avoid the quagmires that the US was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I think another indication that we are probably heading towards an US strike is the fact that Trump's turned his back on his MAGA base. He's been criticizing Tucker Carlson and others, I think suggesting that, I've made up my mind, I'm doing what I'm doing, you guys don't know anything. That's exactly kind of what he said to Tucker Carlson. I wanted to, before we go into some of the other geopolitical outcomes of this, just go back to the negotiations. You mentioned that the Americans probably were conducting those negotiations in good faith. If that is the case, then I guess, the question needs to be asked, did Israel attack Iran because it wants to kill any kind of peace negotiations? And if that is the case, I guess there's a lot of there's a lot of history where Israel has actually done that. I think there were reports before killing Hassan Nasrallah. Hassan Nasrallah was willing to negotiate a peace deal. Israel also assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who was also again negotiating on behalf of Hamas. And in this case, Israel has assassinated Ali Shamkhani, who was also, before he was assassinated, he said, we are close to some kind of a deal. So this would suggest that, that the main purpose of the attack on Friday was to torpedo any kind of negotiation or peace deal with Iran.
Yes. Yes. I mean, again, the broader context is that Israel, a nuclear power, is seeking to maintain its monopoly on the possession of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And in this case, Israel has launched a war of aggression in order to derail the prospect of a diplomatic resolution of the differences between the US and Iran, because its actual agenda is regime change in Iran. Because as virtually every expert who has looked into this has concluded, the Iranian nuclear program cannot be permanently dismantled through military means alone, given the level of its development, and certainly not from the air alone. And to do so would essentially require replacing the Iranian leadership with one that is prepared to denuclearize the entire country. That has certainly been the Israeli theory. And if you look at the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra these days, they're pretty much saying the exact same thing. If you look at Israel's apologists in the US Congress, they're basically agitating 24/7 for US participation in offensive operations against Iran, because they say, it's time to get rid of the mullahs and all the rest of it. Now, let's be clear about the U.S. role. The decision the U.S. is going to make is not about whether to get involved or not, because the U.S. is already very, very deeply involved. It's quite clear that that Israel would not have attacked Iran without U.S. authorization. The U.S. knew about this attack in advance and helped, once that decision was taken, the US then did engage in camouflage and did play along with this ruse by seeking to persuade the Iranians that it was still negotiating and negotiating seriously in order to lull the Iranian leadership into a false sense of security. The US, of course, has supplied Israel with all the weapons it is using to bomb Iran. We can no longer just say Israel. We need to say the U.S. supplied Israeli Air Force, the U.S. supplied an armed Israeli military, and so on. And of course, with unlimited diplomatic cover. So the U.S. is providing Israel with all kinds of intelligence. So the U.S. is already a direct participant in this war. The question is not about whether or not the US is going to participate, but about whether or not the US is going to escalate its involvement by getting directly involved in offensive operations inside Iranian territory.
And you mentioned regime change. How vulnerable is Iran to regime change? And we saw Sunday 5 car bombings, terrorist act, ISIS-style car bombings in Tehran, which would suggest, that there's, of course, assets in Iran who are stoking chaos and mayhem to accelerate to some kind of a regime change. And we saw the propaganda as well from ex-Iranian royalists and pro-Iranian royalist members of the Congress who are stoking, fueling chaos and mayhem for some kind of a regime change. So how likely do you think that is? And also, do you think Iran is also guilty of the Ayatollahs anyway, guilty of being lulled into some kind of false sense of security? Because it seems like they were also unprepared, and I think it would have been naive that they were somehow lulled into some kind of a false sense of security. that false sense of security may have cost lives and push them back.
Well, Iran saw the extraordinary effectiveness of Israel's efforts to decapitate Hezbollah's leadership last summer and last fall. It has seen how Israel managed to kill the head of Hamas in its own capital last July. And yet, Israel was able to successfully mount a similar decapitation strike against the Iranian security leadership on the first day of this war. So there's quite clearly extraordinary negligence and dereliction of duty on Iran's part. Having said that, Israel's intelligence services, which proved to be not only very effective here, but were also supported by the full might, the full force of what is probably the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in human history, namely the United States, also seems to have assumed that a successful decapitation strike would create the condition, would first of all create such confusion, chaos, and disarray in the leadership ranks of the Iranian state, government, and security forces that Iran would not be able to successfully respond or effectively respond. And secondly, Israel also persuaded itself that a successful initial strike would create the conditions for a popular uprising by the Iranian people against the Islamic regime and bring about regime change. And on the more lunatic fringe of this already very lunatic Israeli political spectrum, there was also the expectation, that that Shah Jr., I can't remember what his name is, that Pahlavi rule would be restored in Iran by the end of the week. I mean, you look at social media, and it's taken as a given, that Pahlavi rule will resume in Iran at the end of this. Now, a lot of this is extraordinary wishful thinking. First of all, unlike Hezbollah, which is a political movement, Iran is a state. And unlike, for example, the regimes in Iraq and Syria, the Islamic Republic regime in Iran is much more coherent, much less centered on the authority and authoritarianism of a single individual, and is much more institutional and much more diffuse. Secondly, you look at history wherever you want, and there's very little evidence that foreign aggression um, enhances rather than reduces domestic polarization and leads to effective challenges against governments. And Israel, more than anyone else, should have been aware of this because if you'll recall, before October 7th, for an entire year, there were growing mass protests by Israelis against the Netanyahu government in opposition to its legislative regime seeking to transform the Israeli judiciary and make it even more subservient to the will of the Israeli government. Now, if these theories about Iran hold any water, then it stands to reason that we should have reasonably expected Netanyahu to be overthrown on October 8th, 2023. And that, of course, didn't happen. Virtually all of the Israeli Jewish public, including virtually all of Netanyahu's fiercest critics, rallied around him against the perceived external enemy that had attacked. And I suspect something similar has been going on now within Iran, just as something similar happens in virtually any identical circumstance. All the more because you cannot possibly interpret what Israel has done as an attack against Iran's nuclear program. Like you said, they're setting off car bombs in the streets of Tehran. They've killed hundreds of civilians, and bringing entire apartment buildings down. They're talking openly, not only about deposing the Islamic Republic regime, but even about replacing it with the Shah, who, even for many people who genuinely detest the Islamic Republic regime, have very, very bitter memories of and have absolutely no intention of seeing once again in Tehran. So, it's the problem is we're now subject to exactly the same wishful thinking that we were told we had to accept in 2002, 2003, when, if you recall, anyone who raised doubts about this neocon fantasy about Iraq was denounced as a Ba'athist, as an acolyte of Saddam Hussein, as someone who supported 9/11, and all. We're seeing exactly the same thing now. Anyone who raises not even principled rejection of what is happening, but questions the assumptions that are being made is being denounced as a jihadist, an Islamist, someone who wants to see all Jews dead, someone who wants to see nuclear bombs going off in New York and San Francisco and all the rest of it. It's a broken record.
I mean, you'd think they changed the script a little bit,
But they haven't.
and they haven't. But it's exactly the same playbook, and it's the same cheerleaders who laundered the failed Iraq attack are now again making the same claim.
Can I just interrupt you, Nasim, because you
Yeah.
raised a key point. It's not just the same playbook, it's also exactly the same people. And the reason we're listening to exactly the same people is because they never paid a price for the catastrophe that they engineered in Iraq in 2003. The only people who paid a price for that were the people of Iraq.
They never paid the price, and just as Israel has never paid a price for anything, which this kind of impunity is what has led us to this position where we're at the moment. And I think if the same people were honest about themselves, they'd realize they got Iraq badly wrong. And this is another example of where things may be even more catastrophic given where we are
Yes.
at the moment. So, with that said, I mean, do you think then um, countries like Russia, China would step in? I mean, we saw Russia abandoning Syria, for example, Bashar al-Assad, as he last January, when Shara and his army overthrew the Assad regime. Russia didn't do anything. So, do you think Iran is a different case altogether? Because Iran strategically is way more vital, important as an actor to Russia and China than I would say Syria. And do you also see that as part of a much broader geopolitical tussle between the West and China? Because there
Yes
is
and
that
no.
lens.
Sorry, I
Go on,
interrupted you.
go on, carry on.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, Iran is a different case, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you would see involvement by either Russia or China. Russia, as you know, is already overstretched as a result of its invasion of Ukraine. And China, lest we forget, imports virtually all of its energy supplies from the Persian Gulf, from Iran and the surrounding Arab states, and will be very keen to prevent an escalation of this war to a level that will then interrupt energy supplies from the Persian Gulf to China. Having said that, I think it all hinges on whether or not the U.S. becomes a direct participant in offensive operations against Iran. If it does, then Russia and China will have a choice to make. Will they seek to lower the temperature and seek a negotiated and quick end to the war, which could involve putting massive pressure on Iran? Or will they see this as an opportunity to weaken the United States, whether within the Middle East region or in regions of more direct concern to them? such as in Eastern Europe or East Asia? Those, I think, are unanswered questions. Will China, for example, authorize or encourage Pakistan to get into the fray and seek to administer a lesson to Western weapons of war, similar to what we saw with India a month or two ago? My default assumption is that Russia and China certainly will not get involved. They will make efforts, and I think these will be primarily diplomatic, to ensure a quick resolution and prevent further escalation, and certainly will not want to see the Iranian government overthrown for a variety of reasons, including, that they've also had to deal with the fallout of Iraq. But ultimately, I think they will also see that if the US does get involved, then weakening the US is a job that Trump will be doing for it, and they won't really need to get very deeply involved to help that along.
And again, you mentioned Pakistan. I think just shows what the long-term consequences could be. I mean, for Pakistan being squeezed between an Iran, which is allied to Israel and the West, and India on the other side,
Mm,
I think that poses an existential threat, especially if you have an Israel and the West who is extremely hostile to any kind of Muslim majority countries having strong military, and Pakistan has a strong military. Pakistan has nuclear weapons,
mm.
and I think long term, countries like Pakistan would need to consider the position. Also Turkey, which is why then I ask, the Gulf countries, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, who gave Israel free rein to fly over their skies and bomb Iran, whether they think in the long term having Israel as the sole dominant power in the region is in their long-term interest. Is a regime change in Iran uh, in the interest of those countries? Because in the long term, I think Israeli domination and the submission of all the Arab countries in the region, how can that be in their interest?
Well, I think it's interesting that if we speak specifically about GCC states, and here I'm thinking primarily about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, you may recall they were fully on board with the maximum pressure campaign against Iran during the first Trump administration. And they wanted to see Iran not only weakened, but wanted to see regime change in Tehran. But they've learned their lesson. I mean, they saw the extraordinary damage that Iran is able to inflict on them. I'm thinking, for example, of the 2019 sophisticated Iranian missile and drone attack on the key Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia, but also the intensifying Houthi drone and missile attacks on Saudi and eventually also Emirati territory during the Yemen war. And just as importantly, the unwillingness or inability of the United States and Israel to defend them from these attacks. So what happened is they have already made their peace with Iran. Yes, they would still like to see the Islamic Republic disappear, but they also recognize that the price for achieving this is likely to be prohibitively expensive. So on the one hand, they've made their peace with Iran and normalized relations with it. They were encouraging rather than, and unlike Israel, opposing Trump's diplomacy with Iran, and they have come to see Israel not only as a vital security partner, but also as the regional arsonist who is setting the region aflame. But they have been so deeply enmeshed in the US designed and Israeli led security architecture in the region that it's too little too late. I don't see how they can extricate themselves. And you pointed to, for example, Jordan repeatedly scrambling its air force to defend Israel from Iranian drones and so on. I don't see that. I don't see that changing.
Yeah, let's end with this is Palestine this week, of course. We spoke about Iran through the entire show, but of course, it all relates to what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine. And we should also mention that this idea that Iran wants the complete annihilation of Israel is actually a lie that's constantly repeated. Iran has agreed or accepted an Israel that recognizes a Palestinian statehood, just as all the other Arab countries have done. So this idea that Iran wants to annihilate Israel, it's a talking point, Israeli talking point, to galvanize support for a regime change and an expulsion, a destruction of Iran itself. But let's end with Palestine. And the question I want to ask, I guess, is, uh, where does that leave Gaza? I mean, it seems like Netanyahu has got what he wanted with this attack. The focus is no longer on Gaza. Today, there was another mass casualty event. Something like 90 Palestinians were killed, 90 Palestinians seeking food from seeking food in Gaza, and the West Bank is in lockdown at the same time. Netanyahu, who was plummeting in the polls, again, he's now seen as a savior. There's a rallying around the flag in Israel. Western allies who were just 2 weeks ago condemning Netanyahu, who was wanted by the ICC, all of a sudden he's in their good books as well. So, where does that leave Gaza now and the broader Palestinian issue?
I just wanted to make one additional point about Iran before responding to your question. Remember that we're dealing here with a nuclear power, Israel, and potentially also a declared nuclear power, the United States, launching military attacks directly on nuclear facilities in a non-nuclear power and nuclear facilities that are under monitoring and inspection of the IAEA. I won't get into the international law and laws of war aspects for that because I'm not conversant with them and they're in any case become meaningless and irrelevant. But I think it's useful to think about that, particularly given the loud drum beats for regime change in Iran. And if Iran does manage to survive this intact and then does decide that it needs to pursue the development of an actual nuclear weapon to defend itself against such unprovoked wars of aggression, let's remember what actually happened next time we hear the cacophony of the crescendo final movement of the Hasbara Philharmonic Orchestra condemning Iran. And secondly, yes, Iran would like to see Israel disappear. In fact, I would argue most of the world would like to see Israel disappear. But, during the 1980s, Iran also constantly agitated for the Soviet Union to disappear. Did the Soviet Union drop the big one on Tehran in response? Of course not, because there is a difference between rhetorical statements, however genuine they may be and irrespective of the convictions behind them, and then actually um, taking decisions and and implementing policies to achieve that goal. Now, no one who has looked at this has believed that the reason Iran would proceed to acquiring a nuclear weapon would be to load it up on an airplane and drop it on Tel Aviv. No one takes that seriously. Everyone who has looked at this has said that if Iran indeed takes the political decision to achieve nuclearization, and succeeds in doing so, it's going to be essentially for defensive purposes to prevent others from attacking it. A similar strategy to North Korea, and given that in North Korea's case, development of a nuclear bomb has proven extraordinarily successful, we may find that Iran has drawn appropriate conclusions on the basis of what we've seen during the past week. Now, to get back to your vitally important question, exactly as you've mentioned, the war against Iran has diverted attention and provided camouflage for the intensification of the genocide in the Gaza Strip. We are still seeing daily massacres, we are still seeing daily massacres as what are advertised as distribution centers for humanitarian aid, but that are in fact death traps. Um, you could argue that the population of the Gaza Strip has had some relief in the sense that some Israeli soldiers and aerial assets are being redeployed elsewhere, to the border with Lebanon and Syria and towards Iran. But Israel does not need the full force of its military to maintain the genocide in the Gaza Strip. And I think, in addition to that, the other fear is that, particularly if the US gets involved and no one even thinks about the Gaza Strip and the West Bank anymore, that could be the moment that Israel chooses to force the mass expulsion of Palestinians, not only from the Gaza Strip, but also the West Bank and potentially Palestinian citizens of Israel itself. You may recall that in 1989, during the Tiananmen events
Square.
in Beijing, that none other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who was at the time, I believe, a government minister, advocated that Israel should exploit world's focus on the protests and then the attack on the Tiananmen Square to expel Palestinians and put an end to the First Intifada.
Thanks, Mouin. I think it was a fantastic show this week. And those of you who have tuned in, if you are watching, do like and subscribe to our website. We want to be growing this, and I, as always, thoroughly enjoy Mouin's conversations and your analysis, Mouin.
Thank you
And
very
I hope
much.
to
I really
see
enjoyed
you.
it as well.
Yeah, I hope to see
The
you again
subject
next week.
notwithstanding.
Yes, yes. I hope world doesn't take a turn for the worse. I hope we do come back and discuss focus on Palestine next week, and hope to see you in 6 days, 7 days time, Maureen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.